Isn't it funny? I'm Tim, he's Robert. Isn't it funny that no matter what group you talk to, no one ever wants to sit in the front? Like, because I mainly speak to like middle schoolers in my other career, and it just always cracks me up. You have to beg them and like lure them with candy, small chocolate treats. That's just to say we won't hurt you.
Did you bring candy?
I didn't bring candy. That's the problem. I have like one stick of gum in my backpack. Okay, sorry, over to you.
Do it,
Robert.
is it?
This is your event. This is your event.
Well, it's great to be here, and I know that this was scheduled for last January, and I was very sorry that it had to be canceled, although I was also relieved that I wouldn't have to brave the snow when there were these blizzard warnings. So, but in any case, I'm thrilled that it worked out for now. So, I guess we're going to start a conversation.
Yes, we're going to have a conversation. We've just met. This is something I think how many people here are in publishing? I'm just curious, other than the people who invited us. And then how many other people are writers in the room? Just curious if there's there's always an overlap. And how many people are just up here for the rare books? And they're like, you have to sit if you want a rare book. So often at publishing events, you just sort of meet the person as soon as you walk in, which is funny. So I actually, for some reason, of course I know all about you, and I thought for some reason you lived in Baltimore, but you now live in Seoul?
That's right.
That's maybe the biggest trip I've ever heard someone take for a book event. So you live in Seoul. So when did you get into the city?
Let's see, I've been here for about, I'm trying to remember, 4 days, I think. But I've been in the U.S. now for about 10 days. So
Okay.
so I have to admit, I didn't come here only for this evening.
That would really be
Strand,
something, yeah.
Yeah. But it certainly went in the highlights of my trip. So.
So how much time did you spend in modern day Berlin, which is I guess the only kind of Berlin you could spend time in? How much time did you spend in Berlin researching gay Berlin?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I guess I've been going to Berlin for longer than I'd care to admit, probably at least 20 years, but I think I've only spent maybe portions of the last 8 or 9 years doing research. So, but in that period, I've maybe cumulatively had maybe 2 years time. And that includes some time off from full-time teaching and summers, and sometimes even breaks between fall and spring semesters. So, but
for anyone in the audience who, this is probably not most people, but for anyone who isn't familiar with gay Berlin, but is here because they know this is sort of a launch to Pride in New York City, et cetera. How do you sort of, because now it's been out for a little while, and how do you talk about gay Berlin for somebody who has not read the book, in terms of what drew you to it originally as sort of a scholar, and also, I mean, I have so many questions about how it relates to the world we live in now, but why gay Berlin, and what is the book?
I think I'd have to start just by admitting that I'm a historian of Germany, so in that respect, there's nothing terribly interesting about my sort of attraction to the topic. But I also realized that it was a story that probably hadn't been told. I knew it hadn't been told. Certainly there were no good English language accounts of what I wanted to sort of narrate in this book. And I was also, well, I'll just come clean. I mean, there's a great book that really inspired me, but I thought that in some respects it was really misleading, at least in the way that it was sometimes universalized, and that's George Chauncey's Gay New York. And again, I think it's a brilliant book. I think it's really fantastic. He makes a particular argument about the nature of identity in New York, and he argues that there really weren't any significant sort of essentialized sexual orientations before the end of the Second World War. And so what was significant maybe into the 1930s and 40s, at least in this urban context, was your, you could say, gender role. So it didn't matter what or who your sexual object choice was, it mattered that you were doing and not being done. So, and that meant that one could remain a man as long as one was sort of in the active role, and that meant that there was no such thing, in fact, as a gay man or a gay woman or a homosexual. And
in a way, isn't that so? I don't want to say forward-thinking, but isn't there something really radical about it, not just for the day and age in which they said it, but even sort of thinking now, where you turn on the news and there's so much going on right now between Caitlyn Jenner, everything that's come up this week with everything happening in Spokane. So it seems as if they were really, I don't know if it's right to say ahead of the curve having this conversation, but it was a rather big idea that they had.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, in some ways it was maybe reminiscent of a kind of postmodern queer identity, which is maybe more common today, especially under the under maybe, I don't know what, 40 crowd or under 30 crowd. I mean, so there are a lot of people, I think, who would reject the notion of some kind of fixed sexual orientation, and they would view their own identities as completely fluid, or maybe very fluid, and they would see sexuality completely on a spectrum, also for themselves.
Even like, did anybody here see this interview last week with Miley Cyrus, the sort of pop star? And she went on the record. I know there's some great, colorful faces happening in row 2. I would never read a Miley Cyrus interview, but she went on the record as talking about these very things, the sort of gender fluidity, which even today is making these kind of big BuzzFeed news flashes. Like, wow, imagine a pop star today. Imagine another pop star, Taylor Swift, or somebody coming forward, and I think Miley Cyrus's quote was something like, "I don't care, as long as it's legal and not hurting animals, I don't care who's loving whom, and like, as long as everything's consensual." And even today in 2015, that is actually making headlines, that somebody is, without a publicist, sort of filtering it, saying this and being incredibly, sort of forthcoming with her own feelings. I find it fascinating that we're still dealing with that being a headline.
I agree. It's something that hasn't gone away. It won't go away. So, in any case, I guess part of my motivation was to make an argument that, in fact, there was a kind of invention of an essential or an essentialized sexual orientation and identity long before, say, the 1950s, 60s, or even the post-Stonewall period. And it really happened in Berlin already at the very end of the 19th century. So Berlin is in some respects, I think, really special, and it's a very complicated story. I mean, it has to do with this specific urban environment. It also has to do with the character of, I'd say, German science, and it also has to do counterintuitively with a kind of very progressive, a kind of self-interested toleration of a gay subculture and milieu within Berlin already at the very end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But what emerges out of this is this fixed notion, or this very strong notion that identity, sexual identity and sexual orientation is something that is probably biological, or it's somehow hardwired or innate. And I think this is something you don't really see in much of the rest of the Western world until relatively late. So so in this respect, George Chauncey, I think, is right. But I think it's also misleading to argue that didn't exist anywhere.
How did they arrive at that idea? This kind of inherent how did they arrive at that idea in Berlin? Well,
I always have to start with the law. I mean, so it was criminalized, certain sexual acts between men. And this wasn't the case everywhere in Europe. So there had been what we describe as anti-sodomy statutes since the Middle Ages. But starting with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Code, these laws were, in some cases, just simply ignored or eliminated. And that was true in France and most of the Mediterranean world, also the Low Countries, the Netherlands, eventually Belgium, and also in some of the German territorial states, but not in Prussia. And so it's significant that this law survived, I think, in Germany, in Prussia, and then in unified Germany after 1871, because it was sort of like the irritant that provoked a response. I mean, people had to worry about enforcing the law, so police had to worry about it. Forensic physicians, people who made a kind of expert testimonies in court, had to come before a judge and say, this person is a sodomite, has committed these crimes. And so it was something that ended up having to be studied. I mean, you had to actually think about it and pay attention to it. And this is part of the reason I think that it emerged in the way it did in Germany, in Berlin especially, and not, for example, in Paris or in France. So I think that's a big part of the story. And then I think Berlin also, in a lot of ways, was very special. I mean, so it was initially not a very impressive city, and by the late 19th century, it had grown almost exponentially within a couple of decades, and it had a lot of problems, but because it got so large so fast, there were just a lot of spaces. There were a lot of places where people could more or less disappear, and I think it created sort of the opportunity for this subculture to develop and sort of establish itself. So I think that's a big part of it.
Do you feel like Berlin to this day maintains a kind of queer identity that no other city has?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's exactly unique, but I mean, there's been a mayor. There's been a gay mayor of Berlin for I'm not sure how long he's been in office. At least close to 20 years now. Wow. And one of his famous quips is, Berlin is poor, but it's sexy.
Wow.
and
straight from the travel office.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
really
And I think Berlin has also very self-consciously sort of marketed itself as a pink queer capital for at least since the 90s, at least since unification. So,
I mean, this is so on the nose, but for a lot of us, at least for me, when I think gay Berlin, the very first thing I think of is cabaret as my sort of way in, which how much of that culture, how much of what we see in like the 70s version of cabaret that so many of us saw as maybe like I've never been to Berlin, so my version of Berlin is like Liza Minnelli screaming in the subway. So how much of Berlin sort of still evokes that character that we see in something like that?
Well, I'm not sure that I would walk around contemporary or present-day Berlin and see the 1920s or early 1930s. Although there is still in some ways a certain rawness, and there's certainly a kind of energy. So it's notorious even now, I think, for its club culture, and there are all kinds of sexual subculture. So I mean, it's not just something that you would describe as LGBT.
Right.
Q.
One of the reasons I ask is because I'm here sort of because Anne Bausum wrote this book Stonewall, which I narrated. Otherwise, I have no connection to it other than being gay. And I recently went back to the Stonewall Inn for the first time since I was like 20, and which I snuck in at the time, and it so retains the feel of it could be that night in 1969, even though so much of it's been redone. So I find it interesting that some of these pockets of communities that sort of, especially like nightclubs and gay bars that housed a certain kind of marginalized community, still when you go maintain a feel like, wow, this sort of never changed in a way. It just still feels like this.
Yeah, that's maybe a harder argument to make for a place like Berlin, because the city was so destroyed in the Second World War. It was close to flattened, at least major portions of it, and it was also then of course divided. And that division also had a huge impact. So in some ways, the Berlin of the early 21st century is a very different place from the Berlin of the early 20th century. On the other hand, though, So I think there is. I would use the word energy maybe to describe it. And so it's a city that's always sort of reinventing itself, and I think that continues to this day. So in some ways, the kind of development and growth that one sees since unification in the early 90s, it's not entirely unlike this really rapid growth and industrialization that took place in the late 19th and very early 20th century. So, but in part because of its dynamism, it's still attracting a lot of innovative people, I think, and people who are sort of experimenting, and a lot of people who are in the arts. And I think the mayor's description, poor but sexy, is actually really really apt.
Doing that, like, that's just so funny. I mean, I guess we have like keep Austin weird, but it's funny. Just to switch gears for a second, just talk about your sort of writing process, because as a writer, I'm always interested in how people approach stuff. So I was reading a little bit. So you were born in Puerto Rico, is this true?
That's right. Yeah.
And you spent a lot of time in Indiana.
Yeah, that's true.
So at what point were you like Germany? Like how did you do that leap? Because that feels, maybe for someone who's just learning about you for the first time, it feels like a leap. So, and not just one book, but obviously you have this real draw there. So how does that start for you? How did that start?
That's a good question. I suppose I was first sort of attracted because I simply studied the language, and I started in high school, so that was one point. And I did then get to live in Berlin as a student. Actually, I was 21, the same age that W.H. Auden went to Berlin for the first time, and that was in fact before unification, so before the wall came down. And at that point, I was really impressed. I mean, it was still a Western sort of exclave within the East Bloc, at least West Berlin was, and so it was encircled essentially, and that just created this very strange sort of culture, and it was also at that point already, certainly in the 80s, a very adventurous place. I mean, so there was a lot going on, and there was already a very open gay scene, you could say. And so once I had gotten to Germany and sort of seen the place, it was a place I always had to go back to. I couldn't quite resist its draw. So
I do think it's interesting when you ask somebody who so clearly has an affinity for a place. I've actually never been to Germany, but my grandparents were like potato farmers in Indiana, and they were 100% German, so there's some kind of bond here. And but I do think it's interesting. I'm just trying to draw that we're alike. I do think it's interesting when somebody has such an affinity for something, because like I grew up, my parents took me and my older brother to see the National Tour of Cats, and I was like, that's what I want to do when I get older. I want to be a professional cat. And so, but if you had said to me like, how did you get attracted to theater, I would really have to look back, because it feels like such a part of me. It's interesting that it even takes you that hiccup to go, like, because it wasn't necessarily. Did you grow up with German culture in any special way otherwise?
Yeah, I suppose I did. I mean, I grew up in a Mennonite and Amish sort of community in northern Indiana, and in fact, actually my parents are well, they speak a German dialect called Pennsylvania Dutch. So,
of course. We used to buy pies from the Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yeah.
I'm from Pittsburgh.
Oh, right.
They made incredible pies.
Yeah. Shoofly, maybe. Or,
right. They could really make a pie.
My mother could make those.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So.
And then in terms of just writing process, to sit down and write something that's going to be such a definitive account of an era, particularly an era that, you know, we're sort of taking your word for it, because of course we can't necessarily go and check ourselves. So how do you, for a publisher like Knopf, such a big deal, so how do your writing process, do you know what the book is going to be when you sit down, or how much of it is sort of like selling the book on a pitch and then going, well, now I have to figure this thing out?
That's a great question. I can't admit that I had ever sold a book on a pitch before, so that was actually a process I wasn't familiar with, and
it's a lot of pressure, isn't it?
It's a lot of pressure.
It's scary.
Yeah. I mean, I had an agent who sold the book, but she sold it on the basis of a 15 or 20 page proposal. So I hadn't even completed an entire chapter, and I mean, but I had a pretty good idea. I'd done a great deal of research by that point, and I had a pretty strong sense of what it was going to look like. But I spent another 4 years after that contract was in hand to actually complete the writing, and so it went in different directions. And I guess I'm a historian, so everything I do is supposed to be based on sources, ideally primary sources, and then secondary sources to the extent that there's material that's already that is scholarship that's already been published on a given topic, on this topic, for example. And in my process, and I think most historians would describe this similarly, one doesn't really know for sure what the sources are going to be, what one will find. So it's always one has a hypothesis or an expectation or a thesis, but then it's a bit of a treasure hunt. You go out and you start digging in archives, in libraries, and you collect a lot of material. You try to process it and sort of synthesize it, and that ends up shaping your initial thesis, reshaping it, and sometimes you have to throw out old ideas that just aren't going to work. Other times what you find confirms what you were expecting to find. It's there, in fact. So but it's this back and forth, and it's just this ongoing process until you I guess almost always there's more material than you can absolutely sort of include, maybe even really properly synthesized, but at a certain point you feel as though you've looked at enough stuff and you've gotten the story right. So what you're finding continues to confirm what you started out with, or what you've concluded, or what you've come to. So I don't know. I have to say it's messy as hell. There is no good,
because I do think so often, especially with the historian, when you read an account that feels so definitive as Gabe Berlin does, the really good books sort of feel like they just came out like that. Like it's like
that's nice.
not necessarily like I don't mean in a first draft kind of way, but they come out in a way that feels sort of inevitable. And I'm sure at 2 a.m. at that cafe in Berlin, it didn't feel inevitable. It felt like, I don't know how I'm going to finish this chapter. Do you go a chapter at a time? Do you go all over the place? I've heard of some nonfiction. I don't write any nonfiction. I've heard of some nonfiction authors who create almost like a timeline on their wall with hard copy kind of paper, and until they have that, they can't even start. Do you have any kind of rituals or processes like that?
No, I can't say that I do. I write sort of chronologically in terms of so how chapters sort of follow, and of course I never write an introduction or a conclusion until I'm finished with the sort of main body of the work. But yeah, I don't know. In terms of process, I can't say that I'm really great with outlines. So I always.
Is that right? That's so interesting. I would have thought, especially for nonfiction, I would think it's really almost essential heading in.
Yeah, what I do is I collect my material. I put it in piles, and a pile is what's going to be developed and worked on within a given chapter, but then. I'm never completely sure, what shape the chapter will take until I've actually worked through all the material and really started the writing process. So, and of course, anybody who writes knows that. When you write, writing is thinking. Yeah. in effect, and you don't really know what you think about something until you've actually formulated the language and sort of committed, pen to paper, or I don't know, fingertips to keyboard, something like that.
Right.
So,
snack to mouth in my case. A lot of procrastinating. Yeah. I read this slightly different, but I read the novelist Curtis Sittenfeld, who wrote Prep, said that if you reread your work and you're on a deadline and you know that there's some way, that it could be better and you know how to make it better, then push the book back and get the book right. But if you reread your book and you know it could be better, but you don't know how to make it better, just turn it in. Which I think is sort of an interesting, freeing way to think about it, because I oftentimes think that there are certain limitations every writer has. Yeah. At a certain point, you kind of go, we have to publish this thing.
Yeah.
Is there a single moment that you remember, and we'll also do some Q&A, but is there a single moment that you remember in writing Gay Berlin or in coming to it that you went, aha, that's the hook, or that's the angle, or that's the fascinating thing that sort of is a parallel to modern times? Did you have any kind of journalistic?
Oh, yeah, I would say, actually, that's a great question, because as messy as I've described the process, I was inspired, and I think, and I had a grand thesis before I ever started it. So, and I felt as though the research I had done, before I ever wrote a proposal for the book or got a contract, I felt as though I felt confident that it was going to be confirmed based on what I'd already found, and yeah, there were clearly epiphanies, that I had, long before I ever finished it. So I guess, yeah. So despite the messiness,
well, totally.
There
Thank goodness for editors and copy
strong inspiration. I'd say,
yeah.
I was convinced that I had something really to talk about.
I was looking at your book right before our talk, and of course I have a copy, and it's a big book. It's a really definitive. And then I was thinking you should really try a YA book at some point, because they're so much thinner. They're just so much faster.
I think that's attractive. I mean, I would like
to do the YA version of Gay Berlin, and they'll publish it somewhere. When I sat down to narrate this book, I sort of thought, well, I know everything there is to know about. It's written for young adults. So if you don't know what Stonewall is, it's the first young adult centric account of the Stonewall Riots, which only in 2015 could this book be written, which is kind of great. And so libraries across America will have it. Written by a woman named Ann Bausum, who writes lots of nonfiction, and who is herself straight. And I'm 35 years old. I moved to New York City when I was 19. I've been out the whole time. And I remember when I sat down to read the book in the booth, and if you've never narrated a book, or if you've never sat in a booth and done this kind of thing, you get 2 days to do it. 2 days to do the whole thing. It's very fast, and you try to not trip over your words.
I hope you had a case of water.
It was a case of water, and it was sponsored by Ricola. and I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to know everything there is. It's not even that long. And page after page, really amazing nonfiction. This is why I still subscribe to The New Yorker. Really amazing nonfiction helps you, I think, turn over stories that you even know in ways that are still shocking. And one of the things that was so surprising to me when I was reading Stonewall was one of the reasons the Stonewall... Did anybody live here in New York during the Stonewall Riots? I'm just curious. Doubt yourselves. This is a safe space. Hi, Jim. One of the things that was so surprising to me was that the Stonewall Riots were in part so successful because the police had at the time learned to sort of fight back against riots, not just from LGBT folks, but just riots in general, by marching in an organized grid. And you can sort of picture them walking down the street. They link arms with the shields. And because of this, where the Stonewall Inn is situated in New York City, in that weird grid of streets down by the Village, where you turn around and you go, wait, it's like the corner of 4th and 4th, and you don't know where anything is, and it's like, I just was looking for pizza, and you end up at a bar. The folks were able to mobilize so much better because they were literally running around the cops, dashing into alleyways, and the cops are going wait, it was like a Keystone Cops routine. And it was fact after fact in this book that was so fascinating. The other thing that shocked me about narrating Stonewall was that very early into that night in June when the cops raided the bar, which was happening all the time that summer, by the way, the cops realized oh, they're really mad tonight. Tonight was the linchpin moment. And so the cops ended up barricading themselves into the bar. So I have this image my entire youth of knowing about the Stonewall Riots, barely, that there were hundreds of cops. Well, there were 5 cops that showed up at the scene. It was going to be this undercover thing, and if you don't know this, I learned that back in the 60s and 70s, but especially the 60s, most of the gay bars in the city were, if not run by the mafia, they were in cahoots with the mafia. So the police would do these kind of fake raids in which they'd come in and they go get out, gay people, and then the bar owners would slip them money, and they'd take a couple free drinks, And the people who were getting the short shrift, of course, were the LGBT folks. So this was a night that was a linchpin moment, and the cops ended up the 5 of them ended up barricading themselves inside the bar. Anyway, this is just to personify that there's nothing like a really deep dive into a nonfiction story to turn something over a million times, which I'm sure your readers bring back to you all the time.
I agree, and I mean it's one of the things that's, I think, challenging about history, especially any history that delves into narration or, is interested in recounting certain sorts of stories, especially in detail. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of history, but it's also it's fun, and I think it's more fun to read probably. It's also in some respects really, really hard to do because you have to find the right kind of sources. I mean, to give you the kind of detail that you're talking about in terms of the Stonewall riots, and I certainly appreciate that kind of work.
Well, one last question before maybe we open it up, because I know a few people out there probably have something they want to ask you. You're a historian, of course. Where do you feel like you actually learned how to write in terms of finding your voice?
Oh, there's no process except doing, I'd say. I mean, I don't know. The art of writing is rewriting and revising, and so it's just doing and doing and doing. And
do you have an
also
editor
reading.
In your head as you go? I mean, are you the type of... Because I ask kids all the time who I work with, I say, like, how many of you consider yourselves writers? And every 3rd grader raises their hand. And by the time you ask an 8th grader, like, how many people here consider themselves writers? Nobody raises their hand. I mean, they're barely, like, sentient in 8th grade. But it's because they've been so graded to death. Yeah. So when you sit down, are you pretty good about just saying, I'll worry about the editor later? Or are you hard on yourself as you go?
Oh, well, I don't know if I'm so hard on myself as I'm drafting, but nobody ever gets to look at anything until I've, worked it to death. So I in that regard, I'm very hard on myself. So I have a really hard time sort of letting something go and letting someone else read it until at least I'm really, really pleased with it. So I mean, the product that I sort of give to anyone else is usually already pretty polished. That's why it takes me 8 or 9 years to write a book, I guess.
Which is so really amazing. I mean, that is incredible. 8 or 9 years.
Spend that much time on
it is.
Book,
it's incredible. It's I think it's an astonishing endurance feat. To be honest.
Maybe so. Yeah. That's putting the most positive possible spin on it. I mean, I would like to be able to write a book in maybe 3 years or 2 years, but I'm not sure if one can. Well, cheers! I think that's great.
Are there questions from the audience? I see Emily approaching quickly. Are there any? We have a mic. Usually there's none, and then there's like 1, and then there's 10.
I'm going to bring you the mic for our YouTube video.
Hello. I'm wondering, how does the difficulty in finding resources and archival material, how does that compare to other projects you've worked on in the past? Was this easier? Did things come to you more naturally, or did you really have to struggle to find these?
Well, I guess I should say that I started out as an early modern historian, so I worked on 17th and 18th and early 19th century topics, and those sources were even harder to work with. So actually, a lot of my materials were sort of documents that were produced on a typewriter, which is just fantastic compared to having to read sort of early modern German handwriting, which requires special training, in fact. So I guess it's gotten easier, in fact. So it's still always a challenge to actually go out and locate those sources, and sometimes they don't exist, and it sometimes takes a lot of sleuthing and creativity to figure out where they might be hiding from you. But usually, once I get my hands on them, they've been easier to read. So, and for this book, for this project, that was certainly the case. So,
cool. So,
yeah, I have 2 quick questions. I actually was in Berlin in 1962.
Ooh.
And should my hosts would this have been something, a nightlife that I might have heard about, or that my hosts would have known about and that year?
Not necessarily in 1962. I mean, this is also an incredible thing about the city and maybe about German culture. This anti-gay law, this anti-sodomy statute, it was actually made more draconian, more severe under the Nazis in 1935. And that law, the Nazi law, was kept by the Federal Republic in West Germany and also in West Berlin. So the West Germans, and even to some extent the West Berliners, were probably a lot more intolerant in the 50s and even the early 1960s than they would have been as long ago as before the First World War, and certainly the interwar period, the 1920s. So, and Berlin, especially West Berlin, especially after the wall went up, which you must have been there just soon after it was built. It was a pretty beleaguered place. I mean, people didn't really want to live there. It was still pretty destroyed, and there was less going on. It got more interesting probably by the early 1970s. So, you know, David Bowie showed up, for example. So, but I think in '62 it would have been a rough place in a lot of ways, and a difficult place to live in a lot of ways. So.
And I forgot, I'm sorry, I did forget the name of the lecturer, although it was only a few weeks ago. There was a lecture and a showing of Some Like It Hot, and I was really quite amazed that the lecturer spent a lot of time talking about how, you know, the topic was not so unusual for Billy Wilder to know about.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, he was Austrian, but he spent a lot of time in Berlin before he made it to Hollywood, and the sort of gender bending of Some Like It Hot is, you know, sort of completely every day for Berlin of the late 20s and early 1930s. So,
anybody else?
Hi, I'm Peter. My first visit to Berlin was in '88, and there was a wall, and then '89 it came down. Two different kind of questions. Can you talk a little bit about how you discovered and where you found information about Mr. Isherwood and Auden and, you know, the people who were living in Berlin, and then what their life was like then? Because there's a few pictures in here of life there. And I think, you know, more modern Germany, you know, the Nazi regime pushed the homosexual movement back into the closet.
Yeah.
But I think having all the military people there when the wall came into being kind of slowly brought it back into existence. Are you working on a future book to examine what happens next? Thank you.
Okay.
Those are my two questions.
Right. Well, I guess the second question first. I'm working on a book that's tentatively titled Long Knives, but it's about the persecution of gay men and to a lesser extent gay women under the Nazis. So right, roughly early 30s or 33 until 1945. So and I really have completed a lot of the research for that already. I mean, I ended up doing a lot of work for Gay Berlin that I realized needed to go into a different study because it's a different story in a lot of respects. So, and I hope that will be out in less than 8 or 9 years. So, but let's see. I guess. Right. So yeah, I mean, there's somebody like Isherwood. I mean, you know, he's a major figure, and his life has been, you know, looked into in great detail. So I mean, I had a chance to work at the Huntington Library in L.A. and they have, you know, the bulk of his papers. So I found some materials there that hadn't been used in any significant way, including some of the photographs in the book, and so that was very interesting. And I mean, Auden is a similar sort of figure, but I also got a chance to work with his so-called Berlin Journal, which isn't very long, but it's a journal he kept while he was living in Berlin, and it gives a lot of direct detail of his life and also his sexual escapades, and so that was an incredibly rich source. And amazingly, that's at the New York Public Library in the Bird collection, so which is fantastic. So especially if you're American, I guess, and you're doing research in this country. So, but for a lot of other people, I mean, there were so many people who were passing through in the 20s and very early 30s, and when I started to dig, almost, I would make lists of people that I, figured out one way or another had been in Berlin, and then if there were any sort of quote unquote ego documents, if they'd ever, if there were autobiographies, or if there were published memoirs, or maybe collections of letters, or if there were even published biographies, I would just start looking, and it was remarkable. Almost everybody commented on queer Berlin, essentially. I mean, whether they were gay or not, and that came up over and over again. So I mean, that was one of the experiences that really reinforced for me that what I was arguing was completely true. So, or was approaching a very accurate account. So I guess that kind of research also was messy in the sense that I could never go to a single library or archive or repository and just find everything that I needed. There weren't file folders filled with interesting, sexy reports on life in Berlin from the late 20s and early 30s. I mean, so first-hand accounts are actually a lot of times really hard to come by, but they're out there. It just takes a lot of digging. So.
It's for our YouTube video. Thank you.
You're on air.
Hello. So what's one of the most surprising things you discovered when you were doing your research?
I'd say there are two things, and I'll try not to talk too much. But I mean, the first thing is the way in which the Berlin police, already in the late 19th century, played a huge role in allowing this initially subculture, and then really I wouldn't even describe it after a certain point as a subculture anymore, to establish itself and thrive. And this happened, as I mentioned before briefly, in the way that they allowed different kinds of gay and lesbian establishments to simply exist. So there were no laws, strictly speaking, against a kind of gay sociability or people who were obviously or presumably gay sort of congregating, and the police realized there was one individual police commissioner who decided it wasn't practical to try to go around sort of busting bars or preventing people from going out. And so by the 1890s, there was already a network of a dozen or more bars that were established and that were known as gay venues. And there were also cross-dresser balls, which were fully sanctioned. I mean, the police knew about them. They were major events, and they would attract hundreds of people. And so, there are lots of reports about these. The other interesting thing is that the police also made it possible for people to study the subculture. So all kinds of psychiatrists and sexologists and journalists and sometimes just artists would actually go slumming, and they'd be given tours initially by this one chief officer, this one commissioner who was responsible for this policy. And eventually this allowed the emergence of a real sort of study of homosexuality. I mean, and that's part of the reason Berlin was so central. I mean, because it was a laboratory, and it was a laboratory that was sort of protected, in effect, by the police. I mean, now I don't want to overemphasize, the toleration of the police, the Prussian police in Berlin, but there was this sort of enlightened attitude and approach that made it possible for this culture to sort of establish itself and to sort of operate, more or less freely. They couldn't break certain rules, but on the other hand, the bars, existed, and they weren't, they were allowed to sort of maintain their business, and in some cases they survived for a period of 30 years. I mean, so there are bars that were opened as early as the 1890s that survived into the 1920s, sometimes even the early 1930s. And anybody who knows anything about gay bars knows that their longevity is usually pretty short. I mean, at least before Stonewall. So so that's really surprising, I guess. One other thing, if you'll indulge me, you mentioned Caitlyn Jenner, and apart from an idea of an essential or an essentialized sexual orientation or identity, the other thing that really happened in Berlin first was the separate and, though certainly related, notion of a transgender identity. So, and this started, it was really Magnus Hirschfeld. I mean, he invented the word transvestite. He wasn't really talking about transgender identity initially, and that was already in 1910. He published a work called The Transvestites, using the word for the first time. But then in the 1920s, he had an Institute for Sexual Science, and this was a place where they actually began to provide and apply a kind of primitive hormone therapy. It wasn't very effective, but they were experimenting with it. And they also performed the first sexual reassignment surgeries, so the very first in the world. And so, and then there's a direct connection from this experimentation to the first protocols for transitioning, which were introduced by Harry Benjamin, who was from Berlin and a German Jew in the 1950s and 60s in the U.S. So there's also this really interesting emergence of the idea that some people are transgender and are grow up feeling as though they're trapped in the wrong body. So, and when you think about it, this is a complicated sort of conceptual leap in some ways. I mean, for a very long time, anybody who was a cross-dresser was simply considered homosexual. And so making that distinction, I mean, no one thinks about Caitlyn Jenner as what, gay or lesbian exactly. I mean, it's a different issue.
No, but I think even as of the Diane Sawyer interview, we were still grappling as a nation with wait, what exactly is it? And it's fascinating. This is one of the things I think is so fascinating about Gay Berlin, is that you really get behind how long some of these conversations have been happening. And that we're sort of still having them in a lot of ways. I mean, there's still giant pockets of America, if not the world, that are still questioning things like this sort of Caitlyn Jenner situation. So that's what makes a book like yours, I think, so timeless, which is so great.
Thank you. I hope so.
Wonderful. Well, that concludes our conversation for this evening. Thank you so much, Robert and Tim, for joining us tonight. Thank you all for coming as well.